What's up, everybody? Dr. Ray here, and we are talking about a racing wheel versus a controller. All right, so recently, a few of my students expressed interest in us getting some, simulation type software, like talking about especially like a racing wheel with racing being introduced into the Olympics. They were interested in getting a wheel so that they can be competitive. And so one of the things I did is I myself, not really a big person who plays racing games, but plays lots and lots of video games, I decided to learn about racing games. So I started to invest in playing them and learning about the control schematics and everything. So this video is coming at you from someone who has grown up with a controller, played so many thousands of hours of games like Halo 3 and all the Halo games, lots of Call of Duty, tons and tons of controller games. But it's brand new to a wheel. Though I will say I probably have about 100 some hours into a wheel at this point. So I'm not new, like I just used it yesterday for the first time. Because we did purchase them for my lab so that my students could actually try them out. So let's talk about the wheel versus the controller, what my experience was. So I played around with a few different racing games. There's basically arcade type racing games like Forza, and then there are simulation type racing games like iRacing and Race Room. ACC, AC, and a few others. So I really started to play around with all these games, thinking about what would be competitive, what can my students do, how does a wheel function in these simulations, and how does a controller function. So I started to play with the games, and I started to realize that there were some big differences between these two control schemes. And I watched a few videos on it, and I thought the videos always came at this from someone who was really into simulation-based racing and always used a wheel and then would just say, I'm going to try the controller out and show an example of them using a controller and how fast or slow they could go. I thought I would come at this a little different, kind of the opposite. I've grown up using a controller and have just started using a wheel for these games and thought I would come at it from that direction and talk about my experience using them. So I'm going to talk about all the different areas that I've noticed similarities or differences between these two things. And then at the end, talk about what I think you should do, whether you should buy a wheel or a controller, what you should do, how good I think you could be with either of these. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, let's talk about turning. Turning with a wheel versus a controller. So the difference with the wheel is that you're using a steering wheel to turn, and the controller, you're using your little analog, joystick. I don't think that there's very much. Now, I'm not talking about force feedback yet. If someone's watching this and asking, we're going to get there. Overall turning, like making minute changes, being smooth on a turn, I can do just as well on a controller as I can do in a wheel. I don't think there's any difference. In fact, I'm maybe even quicker to turn on a controller, which can be a bad thing because if you turn too quickly, you can kind of wobble around. So you have to be very smooth. So it's maybe a little easier to be smoother on a wheel. But I think if you're used to a controller and you're someone who uses a controller, I'm not noticing a difference. My thumb is so smooth on the controller. I've used a controller for so many years. I have so many hours on it. My turning is exactly the same on the wheel and the controller. I have no problem doing either of them completely fine. So that's the first thing. So that's turning, smoothness, making sure how you're coming out in and out of a turn, completely fine. All right, braking. Braking is interesting. So what I've noticed, because you remember, when you buy a wheel, you got pedals. So we're comparing the pedals right now. When we talk about braking, it depends on the game, because I've been playing a bunch of these games, and what I found is it kind of depends on the game. But some of the games, the brake with a controller is either on or off. There is no the brake's pushed halfway, so you're going to slow a little bit. The brake's either on or off for certain games. Press button, brake on, 100% max, off, brake off 100%. Whereas with the pedal, the brake you can go on just a little bit, just like a real car. So hands down, braking is better with the pedal in most games, but some of the games do allow you to use this little button here so that you can brake part way. When you can do that, braking is equal. But not all the games allow you to do that. And some of the games is just an on or off button. So we're starting to get into, well, how well does the game support a controller? Okay, so but overall, braking's just better with the wheel because it works consistently with the wheel across all the games. So there you go with that. Gas. I found that most of the simulation games do a much better job of allowing you to have partial gas versus full gas. But again, it's the same thing. But I don't think I actually found any simulation games that the gas was either on or off. They did a pretty good job of supporting controller support. So for gas, I would say it was about the same, whether you were on the controller or you were on the wheel. All right, gear changing gears. Now, I don't have a manual 8-shifter. So when I'm on my wheel, I'm shifting with my buttons. And when I'm on my controller, I'm shifting with my buttons. And some of the games you can choose automatic shifting, which I don't recommend. So when I'm shifting with the buttons on the controller versus the wheel, I haven't found a difference. I think it's exactly the same. I mean, I'm using the same exact buttons actually on my wheel versus my controller. So I did not find a difference there. I think shifting is shifting. All right. Next thing. Force feedback. Force feedback. Now keep in mind, I'm using a Logitech G920 wheel, which is pretty much one of the cheapest, best, high quality wheels you can buy. So like if you're getting into simulations, it's kind of like a great starter wheel. Force feedback. So what does that even mean? You see this FFA or force feedback, like what does that mean that a game supports force feedback? Does a controller have it? And what does it mean when a wheel has it? So force feedback is like the vibration and feeling of the wheel that the game gives you. Now you can say like my controller rumbles. So is that the same thing? So in some ways it is, and in some ways it's a huge difference between the controller and wheel. So let me give you an example of where force feedback is huge. So if you're really driving a car and you're going fast and you try to turn, the wheel of the car is pretty hard to turn because you're going too fast. You can't turn it. That's force feedback. So when I'm using the wheel, the Logitech wheel, and I'm going super fast and I go to make a turn, my wheel is really hard to turn because I'm just going too fast. And it's telling me like, you got to put on the brakes and go slower if you want to make this turn. Now, with my controller, it doesn't do that. It's not based on my turn. It just rumbles when it needs to rumble. Like when I'm on like off the track or something, it like rumbles and I can feel that. Or when I rev the engine, it rumbles, which is awesome. But like it doesn't respond to me turning with this joystick. And that's where force feedback makes a huge, it's a huge difference in gameplay between a wheel and a controller. And let me get to my next thing, which is time. So, because this force feedback is a huge deal and it's a big deal. And let me talk about where it makes the most difference, and that's in time. So I think that, let's say I picked one track that I was racing, and there's like tons of them, but let's say I picked one track. I believe that it would probably take me like, let's say I wanted to get the fastest time in the world on this one track with one car, and I just kept racing over and over again. I probably think that the force feedback would allow me to get there about in 10% of the time that it's going to take someone with the controller. And let me tell you why. So the wheel just makes you better faster. So if I'm driving a car around a track, every time I do that turn with the controller, I have to guess if I'm going the right speed or braking right. I just have to keep guessing. I just have to keep trying it over and over, every turn, over again, and over again, until I get it right with the controller. Because I'm just guessing, because there's no force feedback. It's not telling me. So I'm literally just guessing if I'm ever getting it right. And eventually I will. That's the key. Eventually I will. Whereas with the wheel, I probably need to go over it a few times, and each time I get that feedback and can make adjustments and get it perfect pretty quick. So the wheel saves you a boatload of time. That's what I'm finding. I am much better with the wheel, much quicker. If I take the wheel and controller and did 2 laps of a track, the first lap with the wheel, I'm like learning, And the second lap, I'm perfecting. With the controller, I'm learning, but I don't know. I'm learning based on like if my car spun out or not. I'm not learning like did I go too fast or slow. I have to keep going too fast until I just spin out. Whereas with the wheel, I can like feel that I'm going too fast, and it just makes a huge difference in time. That's where I think the biggest advantage of the wheel is in time savings. Because let me get to at the end whether I think you can be as good with a controller. All right, next thing, fun factor. The wheel's obviously much more fun. I mean, let's be real. The wheel is much more fun. I mean, you're like driving. My kids are like, whoa, let me try that. When I was playing with a controller, they like didn't ask me to play. They're like, oh, that game looks cool. But when I have the wheel sitting here at my house, they're like, Dad, I got to play that. So yeah, it is cool. Like it is pretty fun. So like fun factor, 100% the wheel. But there are times the controller's an advantage. Like if you have some kind of injury or disability or something, the controller can definitely be better for you if you can't use the wheel for whatever reason. And also, maybe you're just like hanging out somewhere that like it's not convenient to have a wheel. Like they do take up space. So that's like the next topic is the size of these things and price. So like the wheel is like giant and like it literally takes up like a space in a room. So like, do you want to have another piece of technology like laying around that's like big? Do you want to have a setup for this thing? And do you have the space for it? Like you have to have the space. And that's kind of like a big downfall of the wheel. The next downfall is when you compare the prices of these things. Like a controller, I mean, you can buy used controllers on Facebook Marketplace for super cheap. I mean, like $5 a used Xbox PlayStation controller. A brand new controller is running you more like on sale, like 30, maybe to like $60, $70, but like pretty cheap to have a controller. And if you've ever had an Xbox or play, like you just have one. Like I just have two Xbox One controllers. Like I just have them. Like I didn't have to go buy one. Like I just had it because I had the Xbox. So like the wheel. The cheapest you can find the wheels are like $200 on sale, maybe like $225. The Logitechs start at like around $250 new. So like they're pretty pricey, and that doesn't include like the stand for it. So like when you start to talk about like accessibility, like my students, college students don't have money. First of all, they don't have space because they all live in little dorms and apartments. And secondly, they don't have an extra $250. I mean, most of them, like their cell phone is like their mom's or dad's old one. Like they don't have money for stuff. Like their gaming PC is like a lower end game. Like they don't have like a nice $4,000 computer. So like they don't have an extra like $250 laying around to just go buy a wheel. So like the accessibility is like a huge issue between these two things. But I guess the big thing comes down to, do I think that you could be as good with the controller versus the wheel? I 100% believe that if someone put in the time, they can be as good with the controller versus a wheel, definitely. When I'm racing with the controller, I'm smooth. I can do a lot of things. What I can't do is get the feedback that the wheel gives me. The wheel will take me so much quicker to get to the top. And the controller is going to take me like 90% longer. So that's the biggest difference. Do I think someone can get there with a controller? Yes. And there are some people racing at very high levels with the controller. But, man, it probably took them so much. They'd probably be so much further ahead if they used the wheel because it's so much quicker to get there. So that's where I think the difference is. So if you're asking the question, can I be just as good? Yes. And that also, all of that depends on how much the game supports the controller as well. Because if there's like no controller support, obviously, and you can't use it, like it's not going to be good. Or if a game just does a terrible job of supporting it, the controller is not going to be good. But if they do a pretty decent job, and I find most of the games, even like a game like iRacing, which I think does a not good job of supporting controller, because I think they're like dissuading controllers, I think you can still be very good with a controller in that game. So I think that like, the controller definitely can be used, even with like all the assists off and everything, just as good as the wheel. I think the wheel just allows you to get from step A to step B much faster than the controller. That's where the advantage is. It is a big advantage. And then add in the fun factor, and it's probably worth saving up to $250. But you can absolutely get into these games without a wheel, and I think you can be just as good. It's just going to take a lot more time and practice, that's all. That's what it comes down to. That's my opinion. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think. Later, everybody.